have been working with technology companies, primarily here, but across the country, in any number of issues, both inbound and outbound. So we work with a lot of companies that are, U.S.-based, expanding internationally. I'm probably on the wrong side of the table because we sit here. We oftentimes get in and actually undo a lot of the international stuff that our firms that we see done. So we try to bring a little bit of rational tax to this discussion. So I will probably be coming at this a little differently than what you're used to hearing.
I'm Sanjeev Kumar. I have spent quite a bit of my career in the energy industry. I started with Occidental Petroleum in Los Angeles and was helping lead the global business development efforts. Oxy is I think maybe a $60, $70 billion market cap company. Operations in about 28 countries, so I was managing the business development in about 25 countries, I think. It was a 6-year period of time when I was traveling to 2 or 3 countries a month. Developed power plant projects, oil and gas exploration projects, chemical projects in the Middle East, West Africa, Europe. And then I became the assistant treasurer at Oxy. That was the time when, it's hard to believe, when oil was actually $14 a barrel. And we did a lot of capital markets activities. I raised about close to $20 billion in structured financings, corporate debt instruments, what have you, around the globe. Then I actually became a CFO of a French German-owned company, a publicly traded company based in Paris. And I was the CFO of US operations with about $4 or $5 billion in revenues and operations in just all over the world. It was a very interesting experience. Had to the hardest part was going to Paris once or twice a month. I had to go over that. Last 7 years I have spent in clean technology. So I wanted to pay for my sins being in the oil industry. So I have been CFO for public companies, private companies, venture-backed companies, solar, fuel cells, biofuels, wind, you name it. And I took a company public last year, one of the only 2 solar companies that have done an IPO in the last 3-4 years, Solar City and Enphase Energy. That was a really good experience. It grew Enphase Energy when I joined them in late 2009. It was a $20 million revenue company, and in less than 24 months, we were doing over $200 million. And it went public, a successful IPO, in a very, very, very difficult time for clean technology. But the company grew in about 6 or 7 countries in a very short period of time. And I'm now with Everstream Capital, and what we are doing is, one thing I realized, having been in clean technology throughout the value chain, only people who are making money in clean technology today are the people with money. And the highest return is, whether it's tax equity, whether you are borrowing money. Wells Fargo would know that very well. They're one of the biggest tax equity providers in the US. So what we are trying to do is to create a kind of a real estate investment trust kind of a structure where we buy operating assets and provide a dividend yield to investors, institutional, retail. That concept for clean technology asset class does not exist today. And ultimately what that will do is it will lower the cost of financing and the basically cost of financing for the consumers to adopt solar.
Okay, so with the introductions out of the way, you can see that the panel has a lot of experience, hands-on, whether it is setting up a new company, inbound or outbound, tax structuring or restructuring, whatever that might be, looking for talent globally, and that talent might need to be moved around sometimes. The cash may need to be moved, or capital may need to be moved around, stuff like that. And from a practical experience of Sanjeev, where he has built assets, producing assets overseas in many countries, many continents, and been at the head of the chain in terms of having that responsibility, ownership of delivery to customers locally in those foreign countries, to accounting, to making sure the investors buy off, why are you going into whatever countries you're expanding in, what is the opportunity there. And from a personal perspective, I have actually been a controller CFO of public companies myself, expanded globally, done shared service centers, done a lot of that work, and unfortunately I've had that opportunity to do contractions also, where you're pulling out of countries and having to deal with that. So the lessons that we have learned are very different, because again, every situation and every company is different. So the question might come about, first question might come about is, where do I go? I want to go international, I want to have a global presence, but where do I go? And who would like to take that on?
Happy to jump in there. Yeah, so actually, so before I start, I am curious. I assume, because we're here, that most people in the audience are more interested in talking about what it takes to go from the U.S. to other markets. Are there people in the audience who are from other markets who are trying to figure out how to get to the U.S.? Is that any of you? A little bit both. Okay, yeah, so we are a little bit, okay. So I think given that, we're going to be focused mainly on U.S. companies or people starting here and then going global. We've invested in something over 150 companies in Garage, and I myself started or restarted 4 different venture-backed companies before Garage. I spent most of my career as an operating exec in venture-backed startup companies. When the question comes up as to, where should we go internationally, what I've noticed, the pattern is roughly that when you get to that point, if it isn't obvious, you shouldn't go. And almost every one of our companies over the years that have wound up going international, it's that we've been dragged over. And now that doesn't seem very strategic, does it? It doesn't seem, it doesn't seem planful and strategic and all of that. But there's, where I am now for early stage companies. I mean, if you're an early stage company, the challenge is you got so much work to do here. And there can be this lure that somehow there's this big, fat, cheap, low-hanging fruit, somewhere over there. We had one company that it played out, but it turned out the international expansion was to Japan. And sitting back here, it wouldn't have been our first obvious choice. But what happened was a big company in Japan came over and said, we need your technology. And we said, well, we're not going to expand to Japan. And so we joint ventured over in Japan. And it worked out brilliantly. It worked out brilliantly for us. Another company in Singapore came over and said, we need your technology. It's not clear it's going to work out brilliantly. I mean, it was because the company has so much work to do. The question of where is, so that was a long answer, but it deserved a short answer, which is to say, you can do all the planning you want, you can put together strategic roadmaps. The reality, and we can have a longer discussion about the way the process should go, but the tipping point for your decision is going to be, do you have a reliable partner to help you enter that market? Because I think generally, going into another market without a strong, reliable partner is really, really tough when you're a small company.
And I'll just add a little bit to that. I think from one thing you realize about international expansion is it's painful, it costs more, and I think once you have established your systems, you understand your market, you have your team, you have to be ready to go embark onto international projects. And from our perspective, it's interesting, Enphase Energy is in the solar business. The largest market is Germany. One market that we stayed away from was Germany. And it was hard for people to understand. When we talked to the investors, the first question would be, how come you're not selling in Germany? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, it's a very mature market, and so the pricing point is very competitive. I want to go make money on day one. There's no point getting market share in Europe, you're kind of losing money. Second is that our biggest competitor was a German company. Last thing we want is to be beaten by them and you just lose your reputation. So we wanted to go into geographies where the price point was attractive, we could have positive gross margins, and we could learn from our mistakes in a little bit of a quieter way. And then when we go compete with the largest competitor in the world that we cannot afford to lose against, we've learned our lessons. So but sometimes, like you said, you just have to kind of jump in. But my experience has been be prepared, have your processes, have the game plan laid out, have the team in place that can execute in foreign countries. And then, of course, there's always something new that comes up.
Well, the only thing I'd add to that is, I think we've got exactly the right emphasis here. Where are the business synergies? Where are the people available? But before you do it, call the lawyer and the tax guy. Because you can step in things that you don't want to do. So I mean, we get situations where we've met all these tests, and the business guys are gung ho, but you go into a country that there's no way you're going to get cash out of it. I mean, there are currency restrictions, there are all kinds of tax issues, but they can be overcome to some extent. But you just have to understand, if this is where the business is going, then call us and let's try to, cover your back. But, make sure you call us, or call the tax guys and the corporate guys. Yeah.
I have nothing to add. I think the upfront planning is really important for things like repatriation and just making sure you're not getting yourself into a tax situation that you weren't aware of. So a little bit of planning up front is gonna avoid a lot of headaches down the road.
As a semi-serious sort of rejoinder or extension of that, one of the great things about being an early stage growth company expanding internationally is you don't have to worry about profits, right? Because all our companies are losing money, right?
How can you use your tax loss? How can you use your loss?
There we go. So, no, I mean, semi-seriously, because then all of a sudden, we had this company that got literally, well, not literally, but one of our companies got dragged into Africa, almost literally, but, and all of a sudden they started making money in Africa. And it was like, oh my God. And exactly this point, now what do we do, right? And, we're putting together all these crazy schemes to essentially do three-way bartering to get our value out of these countries in Africa. Yeah. And I don't even understand it. It's like the Dutch sandwich they talk about. So we've got this little company that's doing Apple tax management across multiple jurisdictions.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, and we're going seriously. Pretty quickly it hits you.
Right.
And oh my God.
I thought somebody had a question.
Well,
No.
if I call the tax guy, are there some countries where I simply just would not go?
That's a tough question. I'm going to tell you there are countries, and I'm not going to tell you which countries, but there are countries where, for particular currency issues, there are some countries that you shouldn't be doing business in. There are boycott countries. There are other kind of countries you just need to be careful of.
Right, North Korea is a prick one.
Yeah. Got that one.
Syria.
We can do that one.
Syria, Cuba,
Yeah.
Iran.
But seriously, though.
So it always depends, mostly outside of those.
Correct.
Well, it also depends on what you're selling. because one of the things that I want to bring up, at least later on, maybe this is a good segue into it, is what is your product and what are you selling into whom? Because there's export controls, and Glenn can talk a lot about it, because you can't sell technology to Korea, for example, North Korea, or Syria, or
Iran.
places. There's a ton of places, and depends on what your technology is used for. I have known of companies that have been shut down because the Department of Commerce came knocking and said, you just ship to this guy, you shouldn't have. And you're shut down till you prove to us that you're not doing this ever, and you haven't done anything else. But Glenn, you may want to expand on that piece of the export compliance issues.
Yeah, I mean, restrictions on sales to embargoed and sanctioned countries it's a real risk, and they can shut you down. Again, it requires, a little bit of upfront planning to make sure that you're not shipping to these certain countries like Syria, Cuba, North Korea, Iran. But there's, in the event that you actually need to do that, you can work with these regulatory agencies and get, a license or some sort of exemption from the export control. But again, you don't want to be in a situation where you have someone from the regulatory agency knocking on your door asking why have you done this without having some sort of answer or showing that you've been diligent up front.
We just ran into a strange thing today with a client that they were getting, some of the governments were coming after them on privacy controls. And, leaving cookies on computers is illegal in, various countries. And so some of the issues that, we had not thought, never crossed our minds, but really are growing issues.
Yeah, so let's cover some of the other regulatory issues at this point, now that we're heading down that thread. So the things that immediately come to mind are like Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA. Everyone's aware of what that is. It's an anti-bribery act. And generally it prohibits any direct or indirect payment to a foreign government or official or entity for the purpose of influencing any act or decision in order to obtain business from them. And any company that's operating in the United States that also has operations outside of the United States is subject to the FCPA. This is an area that the SEC and the Department of Justice are aggressively pursuing prosecutions currently. And the law isn't sort of inherently logical. It's very broad and expansive. So doing a little bit of work up front to make sure you're complying with the FCPA. And ensuring compliance usually requires a little bit of an investment in designing an FCPA policy up front, training your employees about the policy, and doing some due diligence. The training should be company-wide for FCPA, and the due diligence requires a very thorough vetting of your business partners, agents, distributors, and any companies that you're acquiring as well. Failure to do this puts you at risk of violating the FCPA and getting that knock on the door again from the regulatory agency. We talked about export control issues. And then a couple of other things that you may want to consider. There's obviously, you need to consider local and U.S. data protection laws and privacy laws, particularly if data is being sent between the U.S. and the international jurisdiction. And non-compliance with data privacy, not only is a legal problem, but in this day and age, it generates a significant amount of negative media, fines often, and brand damage, and of course, regulatory enforcement. And the final thing is, protection of the company's intellectual property rights, and we can talk about that a little bit. But to the extent that you've developed a brand and technology in the United States, and you've done intellectual property filings, patent filings, trademark filings in the U.S., those filings aren't going to be good in the foreign jurisdiction. So you should make sure that you have sort of your ducks in a row regarding the protection of your intellectual property in that particular jurisdiction before you're heading into the jurisdiction. So those are the sort of high-level regulatory things that I wanted to cover.
And I'll tell you, it's a very practical, I mean, you just talked about the FCPA. Coming from the oil industry, back then at least, some countries used to get a tax deduction in their home countries for bribery. And, US, we had to put in extremely strict controls in place. I cannot overemphasize that. In fact, I was recently advising a board of a company that is selling in Asia. And one of the board members is actually CEO of a top Fortune 10 company. And the country where they wanted to go is the largest market. It's an incredible market. The price of that market is just amazing for him. And put the company on the map. The only problem is that people around the company have indicated to their local guys, for this company's local guys, that listen, you gotta take care of me here. You're coming up with a new product, which is going to replace an existing product. I am getting very well compensated from the guy that I'm buying the product from. And the company decided, they contacted all kinds of lawyers, significant legal work, and the board decided we will not just get out of the country. So that can just have, and especially if you have a board member that's very high profile board members, there's just individual liabilities as well.
There is.
For board members. So it's something that practical is a really serious practical implication.
Yeah.
And in that respect, it's helpful to understand the culture of the markets they're going into. And to a certain extent, Western Europe, when we look at that market, is very similar to the US in terms of their business practices. But as you cross onto the other side of the ocean, Pacific Ocean, the Asian countries, for example, in Japan and Korea, there's just contractually they're agreeing to do certain things offline. So cash is going to exchange hands by check, so it's all legal in terms of the exchange of cash. But what is that cash being used for is obviously not permitted under whether it's FCPA or maybe even under local law. And so, and sometimes what happens is the beneficiary of this cash actually ends up in the US at the end of the day because they're using money to sponsor trips or presence at, say, some convention in Vegas, or Vegas being the hot destination for across the globe. So you have to be extremely careful and understand what happens locally and how does that play into your compliance issues, in particular if you're a US company or have a US presence. And that goes into some of that liability issues. And I think the biggest FCPA investigation is the one on Walmart in Mexico, correct, recently? Maybe not in terms of the size of the findings, but at least in terms of
In terms of high profile.
Yeah, high profile.
Can I ask a question about that? I mean, along those lines, you talk about FCPA, and we've got some people that are going to be going from the States to China, all right? And we've worked out the contractual, agreements between how much they're going to be compensated for and how much we paid for housing and so on. When you brought up the FCPA, and I started thinking about what if they get sick, when they're in China, what kind of health insurance requirements is our company obligated to pay, as well as what if they get in trouble?
Mm-hmm.
What if they get arrested, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or whatnot, someone accuses them of something, what kind of liabilities are our company exposing themselves to? What kind of protections do we have? I mean, this is an American company, but a German-based company.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you are sending, if you're sending one of your key employees to go open an office in a foreign jurisdiction, you really have to be careful because, they are a U.S. citizen, they're an employee of your company, but as soon as they're opening an office in that jurisdiction, you've set up a subsidiary, they're actually subject to the employment laws in that jurisdiction. And a lot of those jurisdictions aren't at-will jurisdictions. As you say, there's often very strong requirements, expensive requirements for health care and those sorts of things. So that's when it's really important to get a partner And the partner can be a lawyer, or the partner can be a consulting firm. There's lots of consulting firms out there who will help you, who know these laws very well too, and they're often cheaper than lawyers, and I shouldn't be saying that. But they will, they'll help you understand sort of what the requirements are, what the employment requirements are, the hiring requirements are for, for U.S. employees who are relocating there, and things that immediately come to mind are like work visas and immigration issues, and those are all issues that need to be thought of right up front, because they sometimes take months to resolve in order to get an appropriate visa for the person to work in that jurisdiction. And then you need, if you're actually hiring local local workers, you need to really understand what the local employment laws are and expectations in terms of, compensation and those sorts of things. For example, one of the big things in the Silicon Valley to compensate people is stock options. Well, in a lot of jurisdictions, stock options are not tax efficient for employees in that jurisdiction. They just don't want it. They want cash, or they want something else. And if you grant options in those particular jurisdictions, often, your option plan in form of option agreements, and I'm thinking of India, needs to be actually approved by a government official before you can do that. Those are the sorts of things you need to know up front prior to heading in. And employment and hiring issues are right up there, along with regulatory concerns with like FCPA and export controls and those sorts of things. At least from a legal perspective, those are the things that should be first and foremost on your mind.
You asked the question about protection. I think that's one thing that comes to my mind as CFO. Risk mitigation. I think there are several insurance products that are out there, and it's really critical to kind of know what kind of protection is available. What's your biggest risk, and then it kind of becomes a cost-benefit analysis. But a significant level of protection that is available, which I think it just is prudent, especially in high-risk countries.
Yeah.
The only thing to keep in mind is that you can buy insurance for everything that's legal. So you cannot buy insurance for FCPA violation.
So, I feel like if they get stuck in China, then there's maybe a little bit of pressure we can bring to bear, but not a whole lot.
Well, and there are certain policies you can buy for, if they did something illegal, like I said, you can't buy insurance for it. But to the extent they're legally conducting themselves, they're properly in the country with the right visas, things like that, and your example of them getting sick out there, yes, your U.S. health policy might extend overseas. You may have to give them notice or things like that, because I think you said in your case the employees go there for a relatively long period. And
8 months up to a year.
And there might be requirements from the local Chinese law perspective that they have to file a tax return for their personal income, because generally the rule is if you're in any country on a 180-day basis,
If you're a permanent resident.
rolling basis, now you need to pay tax both in China and in the US. And there's a whole term used for it, secondment, which most of us, it's like spelling it or something. but there's all these complications. And as you hire local people, there is statutory requirements to provide them a certain level of benefits, and then there is the supplemental, because the statutory requirements, they expect that to happen. That's not optional. It's required by law. The supplemental is what they're looking at, and are you offering the right set of benefits in that particular country to attract the right talent?
Well, this all sort of reemphasizes the strategy we have almost always used for any of this, which is, again, especially with a smaller company, which tends to characterize our portfolio, is to find a local partner and do some sort of either rep relationship or possibly joint venture. Even that adds complexity. But some sort of distribution, rep, ISP, whatever it is, of our relationship with someone in that jurisdiction first, and get a sense of the market. The challenge, of course, is we all know no one else can sell your product like you can sell your product, right? And that's always always the debate that goes on. And when the VAR relationship in Europe fails, it's not because, it was the VAR's fault, it's because we didn't make the commitment to put, our feet on the street. Yeah, you have those debates. But again, I mean, depending upon where you are, I mean, you've got a big company, it sounds like. So you got a really big company. So you've got more resource. And if you've got a smaller company, you don't have more resource. Again, I would encourage, a two-step process in terms of finding some sort of partnership, locally before you get into this, level of commitment. I mean, and again, it also depends on what knowledge you have about the revenues you're going to get out of that country quickly. In our case, almost always the revenues are highly uncertain, and so you can't afford to overbet. Bunch of questions here.
Yeah, so Bill, I'm interested in the startups. So here you are, you put your Excel spreadsheet, you've been doing this for a while. So you want to do a two-step process. Can you recollect that you've gone first step bar, and then what have you done subsequently that has succeeded or failed? You can talk about that. My experience is on the other end. I've worked with foreign companies that have put management teams here, and they've used our firm to put the teams in here. So going on the other side, would you now take a foreign national if the bar is successful? How did you hire that foreign national? How did you nurture them? Be it other experience from the board on the start, though I'm not interested in big company, I'm interested in startup. Right. What have been the pitfalls? What have been the scenarios that worked? What are the gotchas? Just like the folks are talking this from the tax perspective or the legal perspective of the gotchas of certain statutes. What about this most important hiring issues, please?
Yeah, I mean, so, when one company went into Europe, software company had an opportunity for distribution. It turned out we had a customer in France, and you sit at the board meeting and everybody says, "Holy moly, you don't want to hire anybody in France, because you hire someone in France and you've got them for life, right?"
For a while.
And so we wound up hiring a consultant, and we paid on a commission basis. And then we wound up ultimately opening an office in the Netherlands to manage a network of bars and consultants in Europe, and that's the way we did it, as a way to minimize.
And your office in the Netherlands was staffed by a Dutch national?
It turned out right, but it was who was an employee of our company.
But
So
you hired him in the Netherlands,
right,
to be an employee of your company.
Right. Yeah. Brought it back here, did training. We went over there.
He was familiar with American startups. He had that DNA
Exactly.
that his
Totally.
wife wasn't apoplectic, that he was going to be speaking on the phone late at night.
Yeah, I mean, right, exactly. Well, right. Anybody who's in sales these days, right. They have that reality that somebody's somewhere else in the globe.
So great example. That's one example.
Yeah.
Others do.
Yeah. Pardon?
You've been doing this for a
We
while.
did.
Is that-
Yeah.
is this one examples
The
of
most
one
recent
example?
example was. This is almost a funny example, but this is another one of our companies that the obvious first international expansion was Canada, right? And you think Canada, it's just it's just another state, whatever. And how hard can it be? How hard can it be? And these guys will tell you how hard it can be. I mean, and you think they speak the same language, but
English.
I mean, so we did it for we did it via airplane for a long time. So we that's how it was easier to do that. We didn't have to hire a consultant. We just flew in until we got enough of a customer base to feel comfortable that we had the revenue base to support a local presence and the potential that would support the local presence. So we hired a guy, and relatively this company is a relatively small company, and the administrative overhead of going from 175 people, mainly in California, but elsewhere in the US, to putting 2 people, in Toronto. Kablooey. I mean, it was,
Yeah.
everybody warned us, but kablooey. I mean, it was.
So just on that line, so I mean, if as you're starting into a market, contractors, I mean,
Yeah.
figure out a way to do this with a non-employee until you get a chance to see whether or not you're getting traction. Because that's what we recommend. Because as Bill says, you're the administrative nightmare of one employee.
But he's already demonstrated
It's
that he has
stunning.
sales in Canada. He already checks that box. He's ahead of you. He's now saying that he did do that.
Right.
He's overwhelmed now with the administrative. In fact, the question now to ask him is, did you put pen to paper and realize that you should go back to flying on United or Air Canada?
Well, the team had done the homework and we knew, and they had been warned and we knew that it was going to be significant. So they were more or less prepared for it, but the reality was still a little bit more than,
And you have them do it.
Most countries, I mean, it's really, in my experience, it's usually a 3-step process. So you start the bar relationship, or you dip your toe in the water a little bit.
Right.
And then most countries actually allow you to limited activities for the purposes of sort of sales and limited services over very short durations without setting up, what's usually referred to as like a permanent establishment. And you need to understand sort of what the rules are regarding that. Consultants are great to use, but and I'm being the lawyer here, like consultants in the US, you have to really make sure that they look and they act and they feel like a consultant and that they're not an employee, because you can call them whatever you want, but if the French think that your consultant is really an employee, you're going to be subject to all the employment laws in France. So just be careful. I agree consultants are the way to go up front. Play on the edges, see how far you can push it without establishing a permanent establishment in a particular jurisdiction. And then if things are really working out, then you jump in with both feet and make the commitment and suffer all the administrative costs associated with that.
And I'll give you an example of something that we recently faced. One of our new clients, a multi-billion-dollar company, made an offer to a guy, a Dutch national, on a US paper. US paper meaning, if you read the contract, it looked like an employment offer from a US company. They came to us and said, this is what we've done. And we said, this is useless. This doesn't even comply with any laws in Netherlands. And we helped them get an offer letter that actually most places call an employment contract, not an offer letter. That's a term used in the US only.
Right.
But that contract, it has to be written by a lawyer, not by anybody else. And it is a binding contract, and employment is not at will. So you can't just fire that guy tomorrow morning because you don't like him, or his sales aren't going where you wanted to go, or whatever the reason you went into Netherlands. So a lot of, what Bill was saying, a lot of work has to go into making that first offer. And even on contractors, in India you can't hire contractors. Nobody wants to come work for you.
What about the tax system? Let's say maybe it's between legal and finance. A startup or big company, you send an American citizen to work somewhere in Europe. He or she are they subject to both US laws and that country laws as far as their income tax and all that stuff? How does it work?
How much time?
I mean, as a U.S. citizen, you're always taxed on worldwide income, and then there's tax treaties between the two jurisdictions.
Think about it this way. If Global Upside took Raghu Bargava as an employee and put me in France and wanted to get rid of me, now I'm subject to French law also, which means you cannot get rid of me, irrespective of how good or bad I am. By the way, I still have rights under the US contract that you have signed. So now you're subject to 2 different jurisdictions for that one guy. So there's all these, we talk about, I use the word secondment, and there's the whole expat business, and there are companies that just do that for a living, including ourselves, where you have to be extremely careful as to when you send somebody from here to there, or from there to there, which jurisdiction, because a lot of times people will leave or you want to fire them because of performance or whatever. Which laws are they subject to? That country or that country? And for them, the most beneficial is the one they are subject to. For you, the least beneficial, correct? So you kind of have to evaluate that. I think there's a couple other questions before we move on to the next item.
Maybe joint venture and value-added reseller side and consultant aside, two directions. You're a larger company, and you definitely want to establish a permanent presence. Other structures that would be possibly attractive, say an acquisition or actually jumping in, as you say, Glenn, and setting up an entity. And,
Yeah,
and
I mean-
on the other side, if you're a smaller company, what other options would be available?
Yeah, I mean, the choice of entity, there's sort of advantages and disadvantages of all of them, and it depends on the jurisdiction. But usually you talk about whether you want to set up a subsidiary, a wholly owned subsidiary, and often at times it can't be wholly owned because there's local ownership requirements and local director requirements. So those are all things you need to comply with. You could avoid that entirely and had a direction of just setting up like a branch office or a sales office. In most cases, if you're actually conducting business there, you will have a permanent establishment, and most countries will impose income and value-added tax liability even on that branch office. And then there's other types of arrangements. We've talked about joint ventures, we've talked about VARs, but the key at the outset, if you're a small company, is trying to avoid the upfront administrative costs. If you're actually committing to a particular jurisdiction, the way to go is either set up the joint venture, which requires a significant amount of work up front, legal work to set up the joint venture agreement, or set up a wholly owned subsidiary and have all the costs and administrative burdens associated with operating a subsidiary in a foreign jurisdiction.
If you're an investor considering this, do you care? I mean, the one that's cheapest and gives you the easiest out is obviously the best, but do you care? You probably...
we care a lot. And the investor perspective on this is, okay, think forward to the exit.
Yeah.
And so then the issues become, how does that international presence affect your potential exit? And so given that most exits are going to be M&A, then so you're going to have a buyer who's going to acquire this international footprint at some level, and so some of the issues are going to be IP protection and where
And IP location.
Right.
Where
does the IP sit? Once they acquire you, they can move it to Jersey or whatever they want to move it to. I mean, as in the island, not the state. So IP, compliance issues, and you get just a whole additional raft of diligence on are you in compliance in all jurisdictions, and that becomes an issue, and then upside potential long term. Have you given up because of a joint venture? Have you given up too much of your upside to your joint venture partner, and they're going to say, why did you give that up? We want all of it, right? So that's what the investor is thinking about in terms of how is my company going to be valued downstream in terms of upside potential as well as due diligence, risk, liability possibilities out there. So those are some of the factors that the VCs are thinking about.
And I think there's a practical aspect as well that what I have seen is a lot of startup companies tend to overplan. When you go into a company, my view always is, let's use the easiest structure that's available, but a structure that if the business grows, it's easy to transform into a different structure. You set up, like the US equivalent is, set up an LLC or corporation, which one is easier from a tax perspective if you were to transition from an LLC to a C corporation. So the advice that I ask usually is, give me the easiest structure. Let me minimize the cost, And if I grow, but the structure that can grow into another one without triggering any negative tax consequences in that country. And otherwise, tends to happen, and I was with a startup company when I started with them, pure R&D, no sales, that's invested, and I'm not making this number up, $500,000 in setting up an international ownership structure for a product that was about 2 years away from commercialization. And we were paying a significant amount of money to maintain that structure. The first thing I did was to completely cut it off, and it was triggered a lot of, there was a lot of, some people who were really wedded to the structure and had approved that. It was tough for them to let it go, but the reality, and it was the right call to make. Unfortunately for that company, the product never got off the ground.
It's just, another horror story, if I, one of our companies started as an Israeli company, and they, God bless, they figured that one out. So it was a U.S. company with a wholly owned Israeli subsidiary. But in the course of their international global expansion, they had set up a series of reps in Europe and rep contracts. And very efficient, very clean, very easy. We're thinking beautiful. We're getting a good chunk of revenues out of Europe with no employees in Europe. We're thinking clever, right? Works, right? So we get acquired. Huzzah! Exciting. Turns out one of the reps happened to be in France. I don't know, is there anything from France?
This is the German Association.
I'm sorry.
I point out this event was also marketed to the French Americans.
And I love France, by the way. I want to say, I love France. But it happens. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe not. But they had just written the contract the wrong way, and they had given this guy some. I can't quite remember the details, but there was a degree of exclusivity that this rep had, for his territory, that we're the acquiring company to absorb our company. Then under that contract, that rep had exclusive rights to, there was some unbelievably stupid, mess. So the simplest, what you think is simple, easy, clean, can still get you in trouble if you don't have good lawyers, who, so.
I didn't pay it. It wasn't a boomer hate client.
Right.
Be an FCPA violation.
So it was just our head spun around 15 times when this silly little rep was about to mess up the whole.
Yeah, I mean, the simplest structures are the best, particularly for the types of companies we work with. When you become Apple or LinkedIn or whatever, you can set up like an Irish IP holding company or something in Luxembourg and do this, that, and the other thing. But basically, you can. Investors in the U.S. want the intellectual property to reside in the U.S. company. They don't want it developed in some foreign place and located in some subsidiary down the way, because they don't understand that. They get a lot more comfort out of keeping the crown jewels close to home.
Right. We're just very, very simple people.
Please,
we don't understand these complex ways.
It's not the main topic. Can you just describe a little bit the difference between what you described now about a U.S. company going abroad and by acquiring a company from abroad, and that goes to the U.S. or that tries to get into the U.S.?
I think to a certain extent, I'll make a very blanket statement here. I mean, it's easier to do business in the U.S. So for a German company or some other foreign company to come to the U.S. is relatively easier than, say, a U.S. company going into Germany or vice versa. But the rules are the rules, correct? I mean, you come to the U.S., yes, you have to file an annual income tax return. But the French company has to do the same thing in France also. So a lot of the stuff is same. The culture, the environment, how employment is at will, a lot of these things vary. So you have to be cognizant about the culture and the environment and the laws, and that's where local advisors are always necessary, or engaging with a company that can help you with understanding those requirements in that foreign jurisdiction. Whether you're coming in or going out, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, in my experience, we often see that. We see a company that has been hugely successful in Asia or Europe and wants to become a true global technology company, and they come to Silicon Valley and they march up and down Sand Hill Road, and they're a later stage investment, Series B, Series C. They get money from Sand Hill Road, but as a condition of doing it, they want to invest in a U.S. parent corporation. So we'll do a flip transaction there where, you know, they may be currently a Singapore company or a UK-based company, and what we'll have to do is create a situation where the Sand Hill Road investors are investing in a new U.S. parent. We have to sort of flip the intellectual property and the business into the U.S. parent. And there's, you know, all sorts of structures for doing that. We can do it through acquisition. We can do it through a share exchange agreement, depending on the local tax laws in the various jurisdictions. But in my experience, my limited experience, it's usually driven by a direct investment by American investors who want to invest in a foreign company, but they want to do it through a U.S. security.
That's fair.
Well,
Right. Yeah.
Speak to that a little bit more, though. Once the money's in the U.S. parent, how do you get it internationally? Individual agreements where you say
It's
tax
not
share-
hard at all to send money
It
out of
does-
the U.S.
it
It's
is-
hard to get it back.
Okay.
But can we
I
go
think you had
back
a
one,
question.
just related to that one?
Right.
So what is the reason why a foreign company would establish a U.S. entity or have the parent here as a result of an investment?
Well, it's usually investment.
But why is it such a big deal?
Why would I'm sorry, just to make sure I understand the question.
So why is it that investors would require that the foreign company have an entity here or create the parent here?
Which investors, for a
US based.
U.S.-based
For a
investors?
U.S.-based company?
No, for a foreign company.
Yeah.
Because he was giving the case of a foreign company
Yeah,
comes
right.
and wants to enter the U.S. market, and the investors require them to create either the parent here or to create a
Or to flip it. Yeah.
So just to make sure, I understand, if it's a foreign company that's trying to enter the U.S., and why would their investors of the foreign company?
No, the
No,
U.S.
US
based.
Oh, they're raising, I'm sorry, I understand now.
Right.
Well, several reasons for that. I think number one is compliance requirements in the U.S.
Yeah.
For an investor to put money, look, I've been CFO in solar companies. What's happened in solar is, if you look at every single major company has had a material weakness. When you have a startup company, investors are paying a significant premium, a significant multiple. There are companies that trade at, the comparable is 10 times multiple, these guys are traded at 20 times. So the investors are saying, I'm going to give you a huge valuation based on the numbers you're giving me. They have been disappointed because a lot of companies don't have the internal controls compliance and they're not subject to the US laws. So you're relying on a statement that's prepared in some foreign country. As soon as you come to the US, you now have to comply with every single US regulatory environment. The investors get a lot more confidence that the data, that the compliance, that the GAAP financials that there's a lot more accuracy. So it adds cost, it adds burden, but from what I have seen, it just gives the investors a lot more confidence that they can rely on the information. Internal controls are going to be compliant with international standards. So I think that's I'm sure there are other factors, but that's a huge factor I've seen.
Well, for us, this happens all the time, where there are companies coming in the amazing thing about Silicon Valley now is that Silicon Valley has become a hub for international innovation. And wherever the innovation is happening anywhere on the planet, those innovators, almost all with the possible exception of China, right, flow through Silicon Valley. And so we've got plane loads of, Australians and Kiwis and Finns and Swedes and Nords and Danes and, you know, Russians. The Russians are here. But who were coming to Silicon Valley with their brilliant technology startups, and they've got a team back home. And, you know, but, you know, if you're in Finland, God bless Finland, I love Finland. But, you know, great place. But you can only go so far, right? And so you've got, you know, unless your entire play is, you know, Rovio Angry Birds on the internet, you don't have to move anywhere, right? You've got 2 billion people, you know, from downtown Helsinki, whatever. But a lot of companies, they need some degree of nexus in order to do business. And it happens that the US is the biggest market in the world. And so for most of us investors, we see a cool technology and they're visiting from offshore, and we see the opportunity to build a big company, but most of the bigness is going to be in the US, you know, going forward. And we're happy if they leave their development team in Tel Aviv or even in St. Petersburg or Helsinki, but we want the company, because the growth of the company is going to be primarily in the US. You know, we want that entity to be an American entity, and then you've got these other things like the IP. You know, we want the IP here because we get, you know, how that stuff works. We get how sort of the core of the operations of the company we're familiar with, we're used to, we've been trained in. We don't want to have to take the risk or have the problem of trying to run a global company from a Finnish entity, which actually they're called OIs. OIs? OIs? Why is it? What's OIs stand? But in any case. So that's the main reason a VC cares, you know, in terms of why we pretty much always demand that they flip it over. You know, unless you become globally successful, like, you know, like a Rovio, and everybody sort of pounds over there and says, "Oh, please let me in."
And just an additional thing is, from the legal structure, a lot of the funds just aren't permitted to invest in international securities. They invest in domestic securities. So it depends on the specific fund, but it creates big tax problems for them.
Right. Or if you've got a U.S. pension and you're whatever. Yeah.
And to answer a question, foreign companies, foreign startups don't have access to capital the way we do. Right? Venture capital is a well-understood business here and has flourished. Singapore doesn't have venture capitalism established. It doesn't have the funds established. Variety of companies, so
which is why everybody's
they come here.
And it gets easier to get capital. That's a very important point, because capital becomes a little bit easier. U.S. institutions, it just opens a lot more doors to get financing, whether it's through commercial banks, whether it's through VCs, or just the U.S. market is so sophisticated in terms of providing the financing that it just kind of behooves you to tap that.
And then again, looking forward to exit. You know, everybody knows you're going to get a better multiple selling in the U.S. with U.S. business, or going public in the U.S. on NASDAQ or NYSE. And so there's just so many reasons why, if you're a U.S. investor, you're going to prefer investing in the U.S. entity. So France wants to pitch in. Right?
Actually, that's why there's a French-American Chamber of Commerce, because we're greeting all these French entrepreneurs who say, "Can I please find investors for me or help?" You know, because France is so difficult. Even to bootstrap a company, it's easier to do it here than to do it in France. But my question was back to, I do work for a U.S. company that does expand abroad. And you mentioned earlier, it's about finding the right partner to invest in, so you don't go in alone and make all the mistakes. What kind of due diligence do you do on the local partners? How do you know you're not working with someone who and it's going to bite you back in the lower back later on? That your partner isn't bribing local officials. So what kind of due diligence do you do, and how do you do it?
I mean, it's what you would do in any business circumstance, and you do it here too, right? I mean, just, you obviously it depends on where that partner comes from and how established they are and how visible their reputation is versus some lone consultant. I mean, we generally, while we talk about consultants, the sort of the freelance guy who pops up, that's a tough one, for most of us. I mean, you need someone who's got a track record of working with people you know, the standard can't be more than 1 degree of separation, and you check the references. And you do all that as much as you possibly can, and you try to source alternatives, which is to find out what your alternatives are. But then at the end of the day, it's important that the agreement you write with that person, whether they're good or bad, right? I mean, because you don't know how it's going to play out. And so generally my bias is in business is up to a certain threshold. There's only so much you can do to know how it's going to work out. And no matter how stellar somebody's reputation is, you don't know that it's going to work out. So, my bias is always to design agreements that are stepwise. So you have a relatively early escape, and then you have a renewal, program of some sort, and that's just my business experience. That signing long-term agreements as the first, and as well, I did it with my wife, and and I just want to emphasize, I realized as I was saying this,
Extensive due diligence, though.
there are exceptions. There are exceptions to every rule, and I gotta say, I did not do a lot of due diligence. And I have no regrets. But I do, I got to tell you, it wasn't until well after the wedding ceremony that I found out about her student loans. For example, what sort of business guy doesn't look at the cap table and the balance sheet, right? I would not have that problem
because the government pays for it.
There we go. Okay. Right, and the cool thing about France is I can act to or whatever. I'm sorry, never mind. I was going to say it wouldn't work out because I already have a wife, but I'm sorry. We got a little off topic.
You're cut off.
Okay, on to the next question.
Somebody turn off his light.
I have more of a comment than a question, really. I agree with Bill about the innovation and creativity definitely is here, because I'm an immigrant to this country and I love it. Silicon Valley is my home, etc., etc. But I think the markets, globally, whether startups or big companies, are not the US and Western Europe. Clearly, a lot of companies are going to the BRIC nations and other developing countries and stuff. So I think the world is changing, thus the transfer of international executives and people, like to your point, from different countries and stuff, coming, learning here. Some stay, but then some are going back and trying to recreate a mini Silicon Valley. So really, I see that we are maturing in Silicon Valley, exporting also a lot of talent to BRIC countries and developing countries. That's just more of a comment than more of an observation. I've seen it the last 5 years.
Yeah.
I think what's going to happen is, sorry, please.
No, you.
No, I think, look, that trend is definitely changing. But the problem is, if you're a startup company or even a growing company, the capital markets are so sophisticated in the US that ultimately for your valuation, look, I know of a couple of companies, being involved in companies where literally 100% of the market was offshore. And the company seriously thought about, for tax purposes and other purposes of listing, of being centralized in Hong Kong, Singapore, and other places. But the ultimate reality is that if you ever want to take that vehicle public, or if you want to go do a JV or something, doing it through the US base becomes a lot easier. I mean, I've taken companies public in Singapore, Hong Kong, and I'll tell you the valuation, the investor base, the kind of investor base you get, all those things, I think is definitely changing. Look, the markets are getting sophisticated, capital markets in Asia are getting sophisticated, but I'm still seeing companies where the product they're selling is 100% offshore, but the investors require fairly strong US presence. But I think that trend is definitely shifting differently.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And the challenge, this is called the challenge of international expansion, not the opportunity, which was interesting. But because clearly all of us are sitting here looking at this globe that's changing and saying, I don't want to miss out, and we've been, for all of the history of Garage, we just think, gosh, don't we need a China play? Don't we need a China play? And we're too small, we can't play there, and then Brazil, kaboom, and shouldn't we be figuring out how to play Brazil? And Russia, all of a sudden, should we be playing Russia? There's all this cool technology. There's no question that this is happening, and the challenge for us is being disciplined about saying, okay, you can. This is what you can do given your circumstance. There's no doubt whatsoever that your point is absolutely right. But does it mean that an early stage company should be leaping into Brazil and then leaping over to China and then right? That's the discipline question. Someday maybe, and that's always the question that we have around the board meetings, which is, oh dear, what if somebody beats us to China or beats us to Europe or beats us to Brazil? And you get distracted by that. And I think it's maybe dangerous to get out ahead of yourself until you've got a solid, growing, profitable company here. I mean, generally, and unless we have a company, their only market is outside U.S., right? Their main market's India, and their secondary market is Africa. Wow, right? But that's just the reality of their business. And so it was a lot of extra overhead to do that. But, God bless those guys, they pulled it off. But the CEO sits here in San Francisco. I mean,
Please.
Has the change and strengthening of the U.S. law, like the Upfront Act and other acts influencing actually international business and taxation, influence really the amount of expansion from U.S. companies on any of your
in other words, should taxation limit the amount of expansion in any country that you think about?
In the recent years with the Dodd-Frank Act, with international taxation and things like that. So how did you see any change in trends between the amount of companies from here going international?
I think if you have a solid product, a good market, look, ultimately, it's two issues. One is a legal expropriation issue. You don't want to be North Korea and other countries where you just have no trust or faith that the government is going to retroactively come and change the tax law. They're just going to hold on to your funds. But when it comes to taxation, there are some countries in Latin America. I'm dealing with a country in Latin America has very limited double taxation treaty. They have changed the tax laws recently where avoiding withholding taxes on interest, dividend, being able to finance it, what used to be through shareholder loans and other things, has become extremely limited. But at the end of the day, those markets are very profitable. And, it's a little bit less profitability, but if the markets are great, they're growing markets, and you can make enough money, ultimately it really comes down to it. I haven't really seen from my experience where taxation was the reason where a company decided to not enter a market. You just have to manage around that. But if there are a lot of growing markets where the double taxation treaties are just not that sophisticated. The financial laws are not that sophisticated, and you're taking a huge risk in putting a very complex tax planning. So what I do is, if it makes sense, I basically run my base case scenario saying if you're subject to the full income tax, are you making money? And go into the market.
Yeah, you have to make the decisions based on the economics. I mean, the tax cannot drive the decision. Once you figure out if the economics of the decision of the business makes sense, there are things that you will do in order to maximize your benefit or minimize your tax. But making the decision the other way around with tax driving is not the way to do it. And we haven't seen that much. I mean, what we're seeing is difference in the level of structuring that's going on. And we're talking about here putting their toe in the water and doing things without putting big international structures, because no one knows who's going to be in charge tomorrow and what the rules are going to be.
Just a follow-up to that, sorry, on the tax side, is Brazil almost though an exception to that? Because I was part of a team that did, in a very large company, an investigation into the Brazil tax, and I mean, just the level of confusion and the level of the taxes just seem to be
More so
on a
than
different level than than any other.
Well, I think what you're finding is it's later in the party, and as they're getting sophisticated, they're catching up, you know, and if you look at the overall taxing authorities worldwide, you know, they're catching up. I mean, it's getting more and more sophisticated every day. So we're still dealing with rogue nations from the standpoint of just the taxing authorities, but yeah, I think you're seeing what happens when you're late to the party.
Just another comment to that, it's also, they put up a lot of protectionist barriers as well. You know, if you're an international company, there's all sorts of duties and that just add into that mix as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's beyond the scope, I guess, of us, but clearly there are countries that are shooting themselves in the foot because their policy framework is
Protectionist.
It's anathema to entrepreneurship, innovation, and global, global global trade.
Right.
And so you see, it breaks your heart to see what's going on with some of these countries who should be doing better, could be doing better, but their policy framework is so messed up that they're just holding themselves back.
But you're cooking with gas if you're into aviation in Brazil.
Yeah, right. I mean, if you're playing the subsidy side of it, then and there, it is interesting. There are a lot of countries that are playing subsidies and targeted subsidies as a way of attracting, investment and entrepreneurship. And somebody's done the studies, and generally, I guess it's all generally shown that economic development through subsidy is a losing game. But people keep doing it. I mean,
Well, I would argue, does the research and development tax credit incent R&D in California or in the United States, or is it a giveaway?
Right.
We're going to do R&D because it's the engine, right? Not because there's a tax credit.
Coming, but on the other side,
Yep.
had Germany not subsidized solar,
Yeah.
I think it's a great example where, here's the country with the least amount of sun. I lived in Michigan, so maybe better than Michigan. But I think it was that subsidy. Now, we can all argue how was it handled and the cost today. But if I look at solar, I don't think solar would have been propelled unless that subsidy had been put into place. But for every good example like Germany, there are plenty of examples where it's just a misguided effort. I come from the oil and gas industry, and believe me, U.S. has put in, there's never been an energy policy that has made sense. 25 years.
So we're gonna run out of time here in about 5-7 minutes. I actually want to ask a question. Okay, so fine, we've heard a lot of these stories and we've gone into these countries, whether through a JV or a corporation, whatever the form, whatever the substance, whatever the head count, business opportunity, we went in. Now what? Because now you have to sort of worry about local laws, other compliance requirements. How do you hire and fire people, which is something that we have to do everywhere almost all the time. And how do you address those challenges? So if one of you wants to take that on.
Boy, now what? Well, it's it's once you get over the hump, then it's the issue then becomes you're managing a company that has different points of presence around the world, and now you get into this sort of larger company. Do you have a coherent culture? Is everybody on the same page? Question. And so there's the whole layer of administration, tax, and compliance, and that whole thing, and that's important and that's big. But assume you got good people taking care of that. Then an issue for us, and we see this, and a lot of our companies start as I sort of tongue in cheek say this, they start as bipolar day one, right? Because they've got a development team in Israel and they've got a marketing team here, or they've got they're split, the so-called virtual corporation, and that once you split up your company, that introduces another dimension of culture and management and people, that if you're not prepared for it, if you're not aware of how, a branch office goes rogue, right? I mean, it's, it'll happen. It'll happen if you don't get over there frequently and they don't come over here frequently. You're going to have a branch office go rogue on you. And that's, everybody's heard had these horror stories. So you have to put stuff like that in place.
I think that's absolutely, you hit on two things I think that are really critical. As you grow a company, maintaining the culture of that company becomes huge. You start off as a startup company in one building. Just expanding to another building becomes a huge, huge difference, and you can have a second building right next door, and culture starts to shift. So as you expand internationally, that culture, and secondly, I think what you hit on, the example of a rogue subsidiary or an operation, is the compliance and the uniformity of compliance. That's what I worry about. As we expand in all these different countries, I'll just use a small example. There's a solar company based in Silicon Valley. They grew tremendously. They went from $500 million to $120 billion market cap. And they hired some controller in the Philippines. And some of you who know solar industry, you know which one I'm talking about, which company. They had some $80,000 person accountant. Did something on the financial statements or revenue recognition, didn't know the rules, didn't follow the compliance process that should have been put into place. That cost the company about $5 billion in market cap in one day when the news came out that there's a material weakness. So when you grow, it's what worries me is things are just growing so rapidly. How do you know you've got the right process, the right people, and they're going to follow that process? Something as simple as that can cause a permanent erosion in market cap, and guess what? The CEO and CFO had to go on the road just to explain, look, trust our books. That was just a rogue example. And
let me just, I think that the point that's being made is, we talk about the bigger picture of the business and the people and the culture and everything else, but we see the failures for the administrative side, for the accounting, the legal, the HR, the things. We see these failures a lot because nobody's diligent in following up. The people that are in these foreign jurisdictions, they're chasing the dollar, they're chasing the sale, they're chasing they don't care about the $80,000. They just don't. So the folks back, whoever's in charge needs to be paying attention. Somebody needs to be asking the questions, and that doesn't mean you ask it once every 2 years. It means you got to have systems in place to ask the questions and then respond and do things, because they spin off real quickly, and you just have to have that.
And I'll do a little plug for Raghu since he's not doing it for himself. But getting somebody reputable like Global Upside has been important. I've brought them in the previous company. That gives me the level of confidence that there is somebody based in the U.S. who is familiar with the U.S. rules, is keeping an eye. They know the accounting treatment, they know what the compliance rules are, rather than just using somebody completely locally. It's very comforting as a CFO.
Thanks, Sanjeev.
So the message is hire all these guys. Right?
Well, and to a certain extent, we're sitting here because we're pitching our services, not over aggressively, but the idea is knowing the local laws, but also knowing who you are engaging with as important. Because and that question was asked earlier, how do you go in a foreign country and engage? I'm venturing into France for the first time. How do I know that this guy is not a crook that I'm hiring? Yeah. And yes, he may have come through a reference, but sometimes you get out a little bit and it's just like you have no idea. And so you have to have due diligence. You have to have all of those processes built into any relationship that you're entering into, even if it's down the street. There's how many law firms exist in Palo Alto? Why would you hire Wilmer Hale versus somebody else?
Maybe 100.
Yeah, exactly. And you know people that know people at every one of these firms. But why would you hire them versus hiring somebody else? Because you've done some diligence or that
person is reputable that's introduced you.
Because we host the GABA events.
That's it. So that is important, but there is also a lot of issues locally that we run into where when I was a controller CFO, I mean, things that you don't learn about till something goes wrong. One of the country manager in UK, he had a knock on his door, and there was the guys from the Inland Revenue, which is the equivalent of the IRS, basically saying, hey, look, your company owes X dollars in VAT that they have collected but not given us, and you're behind in paying us. You can either go to prison with us, or you can write me a check right now. And I remember the dollars because it was like a £10,000 check that he had to write, but his signature authority was only 5. So he had to write 2 checks to cover that. Because imagine your country
control issue to me if you get around.
Absolutely. So in one
That's a
respect,
material weakness.
and this was pre-SOX, so fortunately we covered a little bit there. But think about your country manager going to prison versus bypassing some control or doing something. I mean, your options are bad in every scenario in that case. And so to understand that and to be able to execute that, I mean, who's following up on all of that stuff that you're required to do?
Well, further to that, I don't know if any of you guys doing business, the U.S.